Hello and welcome to this podcast from the BBC World Service. Please let us know what you think and tell other people about us on social media. Podcasts from the BBC World Service are supported by advertising.
Hello and welcome to the History Hour podcast from the BBC World Service with me, Max Pearson, and the Witness History team here at the BBC. This week, women in history, from fighting for freedom in the Arab Spring.
I went there not only to demand freedom and social justice, but also for my rights as a woman. It was my first chance to raise my voice.
To providing on-demand, if illegal, abortions in 1960s America.
Physical difficulties for a short period of time, a sense of being taken care of. And I thought, if this is the kind of experience that people are coming through, that's okay.
Also, the Greek champion of culture, Melina Mercouri.
She was, it is not an exaggeration, she was a goddess. She was a living goddess.
And China's most powerful 19th century ruler.
She was described as an evil ruler, domineering. She supposedly murdered her son, murdered her nephew. She was bloodthirsty, and she brought down the Manchu rule of China.
But did history do the Dowager Empress Cixi a misservice? Find out later. We'll be hearing from some of the team that put together these features for the Witness History strand. And joining us throughout the podcast is the highly respected Egyptian writer Adaf Soueif. Welcome to Adaf Soueif from Cairo, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, Max. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
And we'll begin on Adaf's home turf, because this is from the Egypt of 10 years ago, when thousands of people took to the streets demanding the overthrow of President Hosni Mubarak. Women were at the forefront of the protests. And Farhana Haider has been hearing from Hind Nafia, who says that when she went out demonstrating in Cairo in 2011, it wasn't just to bring down the Mubarak regime.
For me personally, I went there not only to demand freedom, bread and social justice as my fellow Egyptians, but also for my rights and freedoms as a woman. It was my first chance to raise my voice.
Hind Nafia was a student activist at the time of the protests. As a woman from a rural village with a conservative upbringing, Hind had lived with anti-women prejudices all her life.
Since early age, I was denied basic rights and freedom. I was subjected to gender-based violence and discrimination starting at early days of my childhood. And everyone around me had control over my body, my decisions, my life, only because I am a girl.
The 2011 uprisings were fueled by the anger of young people who were fed up with corruption, repression and unemployment. In Cairo, women were instrumental not just in the protests, but in much of the day-to-day organisation that turned Tahrir Square from a moment into a movement.
It was so brave and so powerful that women are taking the lead to call people to go to protest. So I was so happy, and I said, I have to participate.
The protests in Tahrir Square, which became the heart of the anti-Mubarak regime demonstrations in late January and early February 2011, grew day by day.
At Tahrir Square, just the spirit there was amazing, and women were there at the lead, and we all were united against injustices, and we were chanting in one voice, down with Mubarak regime, down with Mubarak regime. And we were faced by violence, but we insisted on making the change. We stayed in the square for 18 days until Mubarak decided to step down and leave the power. This was the happiest moment of my life.
Everyone is in the street. They are cheering that Mubarak's left. Thank God that he did.
It took just 18 days of protest, danger and death to remove a president who'd been an immovable fixture in the Middle East since the 1980s.
But things did not pan out as the young revolutionaries had hoped. After the fall of Hosni Mubarak, Egypt's military took temporary control of the country. The protests continued, but dozens were killed and hundreds arrested. Hind believes that the army were targeting women protesters even more than men.
During the months after the revolution, the military has committed a lot of violence. Women were particularly treated more badly. In March, on International Women's Day, women went to Tahrir Square to celebrate International Women's Day, but women were arrested and were subjected to virginity tests by military officers. They just wanted to break us, to prevent us from going again to the street.
But Hind did continue protesting. Along with others, she returned to Tahrir Square to continue to fight for the goals of the revolution. She was among a group of women arrested on December the 19th, 2011.
At that day, I was beaten by security forces who were military soldiers. I was wearing a headscarf at the time. They took off my headscarf. They were beating me harshly. They were dragging me in the street, taking me into the Shura Council, a governmental building. And when I entered this building, I was still being dragged from my hair.
Hind was the first woman to be arrested that day. She was taken into a room which she and other female protesters came to refer to as the torture room.
We were held there for hours, being tortured, being sexually harassed, being threatened by rapes. So I was kept in this torture room with other girls until I lost my consciousness and I was taken to the military hospital.
After being detained for several days, Hind was released while awaiting trial. Her trial spanned more than 2 years and 3 successive governments. Finally, with a military-aligned government back in power, her case was transferred to the terrorism court. On February the 4th, 2015, the judge finally made his ruling.
The sentence was in absentia. I wasn't in the court. The judge was really pro-regime, and he issued a decision to prevent us from even going to our court sessions. So I was not there. I knew because of my women's rights work and human rights work, if I went to retrial, he will put me in jail. And this is a life imprisonment. I don't want them to prison and oppress my voice. I want to continue speaking out. So I have made my tough decision. It was the hardest decision I have ever made to decide to leave the country.
Hind was able to escape Egypt, fleeing first to Lebanon and eventually to the United States. Hundreds have been killed since Egyptians took to the streets in January 2011. A military coup removed the elected president Mohamed Morsi from power in July 2013 and eventually brought in the current regime of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, a former head of the army.
Now the situation in Egypt is really bad and the government has become more oppressed day after day. The people who has led the protests in 2011, they are now whether in jail or being banned from travel or outside the country escaping life sentences.
And Hind, what would you like to see happen in Egypt now?
So now I still hope for the achievement of the revolution goals. Women in the Arab world, they were at the front line of protests and they continue to be at the front line even in the face of all the oppression we have been facing, not only by the government but also by the society and the ultra-conservative customs and traditions. Women are still fighting back, and people might think that the revolution is over, but to me personally, change doesn't happen overnight as well as revolutions. We started something. The next generation will continue it. I don't think it's over, and I will never give up on my dream to go back home one day.
Hind Nafia ending that report from Farhana Haider, who is on the line with us now, along with the Egyptian novelist and political commentator Adhaf Soueif. Adhaf, first of all, on hearing that, does it take you back?
Yes, of course it does. And Hind Nafia is a very brave young woman, and she has a special place in my heart and in a lot of our hearts for the role that she played and what she went through in 2011 and later.
And how important were women to the uprising in Egypt?
Well, women were really important, which isn't to say that they were more important than men. It is just to say that in that miraculous opening up of public space that happened, that sort of semi-utopian Tahrir and other squares, suddenly there was space for women to step forward in a very natural way, where being a woman was not an issue. So it was as ordinary to see and to hear a woman leading a protest as a man. Many revolutionary initiatives were started by women. So, for example, No to Military Trials for Civilians, started by Mona Saif, A Homeland Without Torture, in which Hind Nefa was very important, Art as a Public Space, and so on. Also in the field hospitals, which had to spring up, obviously, where there were confrontations. There were as many women as men looking after the injured. So what I think is that for a while, nobody was thinking of gender, and that really meant that women could take a very normal place in leadership in what was happening.
And Farhana, as Hind Nefa told you, she felt she had to leave Egypt in the end to be able to continue to speak her mind. How easy is it to find women in Egypt now who will speak about those times and about their situation now?
Hi, Max, and hi, Adaf. So initially, my plan was to speak to someone who was in Cairo, who lived in Egypt, who took part in the protests. But as I began my investigation, my search to find a witness, I found that people were very reluctant to talk on record, particularly as this interview was also filmed. So you can watch Hind on our website, in fact, and I'm sure, Max, you can give the listeners a link to that. But people were very reluctant to talk. And one person was particularly keen to talk to me. She even went as far as to talk to a lawyer to see how safe it would be for her to talk. And in the end, she decided that she just couldn't. So I think that is a sign of how difficult it is for Egyptians to talk about what happened 10 years ago and their role in the revolution.
Adaf, was the brutalising of women, in particular, a conscious policy on the part of what was then the Mubarak regime as it fell, but later was subsequently the military regime? Was it a conscious effort to send a message about how firm the authorities were going to be?
There was definitely a deliberate effort to send a message, and there was an effort to scare women away from public space. Of course, as the Mubarak regime was falling, that was a very brief period, that was 18 days. So really it was as the regime fought for its comeback after it had offloaded Mubarak that it really went on the attack. And it targeted everybody. It would be unfair to say that it targeted women, because it was predominantly young men who were killed or who lost eyes or limbs. But, of course, wherever you have a situation of violence and of oppression, then the targeting of women will very often take specifically sexual forms. And so that's why it's kind of so highlighted. So, for example, March 2011, when the military conducted the infamous virginity tests, where as they took women into custody, they subjected them to more or less public virginity tests. Then there was the mass sexual harassment that we are certain was organized and that started taking place later in 2011. And then there was the blanket brutality of December 2011, in which Hind Nefa, your interviewee, was beaten up and had to have stitches to her head, and other young women. Actually, on that occasion, I think that was the first time that we saw older women being threatened and beaten up by young police or army conscripts. That was shocking. At the moment, we have some 300 women political prisoners, as well as about 11 forced disappearances. But it's quite hard to get specific figures. And of course, the numbers for the men, one always has to say, are much, much higher.
And Farhana, that blocking off of the public space for women in particular is borne out by the fact that you struggled to find women who would feel free enough to talk from Egypt about what happened 10 years ago.
Absolutely. It's entirely borne out. And just to highlight the point that Adaf was making about the scale, I mean, in that case in particular that I talked to Hind about, when that case came to court and when the sentence was issued, 229 other Egyptians were also sentenced to life imprisonment for 25 years in jail. So the scale was huge. I mean, what was also interesting about Hind was that she comes from a rural background, a conservative upbringing. So she also had a personal revolution
with her family. I mean, that's what she said to me, that she had a personal revolution to convince them that what she was doing was right. I mean, they first found out that she was taking part in the protests when she was arrested. And then she had to go through another battle with them because they did put her under house arrest for a year. And I'm pleased to say that she's now on good terms with her family, and she's very proud of that battle that she fought at home, and as she says, with her community, to kind of make people understand why she did what she did.
Farhana Haider of the Witness History team, many thanks to you. And that film of Hen the Fair, talking to Farhana, can be found by going to the website, which is BBC Witness History, but look for Witness History Films. Adaf Suaif, who's in Cairo, is staying with us because our next story has affected women all over the world at various times in history. The problem of unplanned and unwanted pregnancy. We're going back to Chicago in 1969 for this, when abortion was illegal, but where a group of feminist activists started to run an underground abortion network, even performing the abortions themselves. The group called themselves Jane, and Lucy Burns has been speaking to one of them, Martha Scott.
If you can't be careful, try to be good. In
1969, Martha Scott was a 27-year-old mother of 4 living in a Chicago suburb when another mother at the playground asked her if she'd be interested in volunteering as an abortion counsellor.
Now, abortion is not something I'd spent a lot of time thinking about, but it felt kind of social worky to me, but that seemed appropriate. And it also seemed illegal. It had a certain appeal.
At that point, abortion was illegal in the state of Illinois, unless the pregnancy endangered the life of the mother, and the same was true across most of America. Women with unwanted pregnancies could travel to Colorado or Mexico, or they could seek out an illegal abortion. These were often both dangerous and expensive, but many women had few other choices.
I mean, not only was abortion not available, birth control wasn't very available.
You can't figure out what went wrong, but that's the first line of the 9-month song.
The Jane Network started with a women's rights campaigner at the University of Chicago called Heather Booth, who'd found herself being approached by several people she knew who were looking for abortions.
And Heather was at that time quite visibly an activist. And so they thought, oh, she might know a thing or two about this illegal stuff. She knew a couple of names of doctors, and I say that word in quotes. So she put out a request for people in kind of the nascent women's movement who might be interested in working on this as a project.
What was the perception of abortion in kind of the mainstream of society?
By and large, people didn't think about it one way or another unless they happened to have some reason to do so. Like if they needed an abortion or they knew someone who needed an abortion. Those people who did think about it thought it was a terrible thing. No one should ever have to do this. But then I also think there were people who thought no one should do it under any condition.
How did you respond to that feeling of that it was wrong?
Well, I did not feel that abortion was wrong. And in fact, this was an interesting thing when one counseled, because very often people would come who said, you know, I know what I'm doing is wrong, but I have to do it. I thought it was really important to speak to the fact that this is not wrong. If you either had birth control or sometimes the people we would talk to hadn't been assaulted, this wouldn't have happened.
The group used the name Jane as a code. At first, callers to the service were ringing one member's home phone number, and the name meant she could filter calls. But it also represented a kind of every woman. Eventually, they got an answering machine.
A woman who felt she needed abortion called and said, my name is such and such, and the tape said, leave your name and a phone and we will get back to you. And then someone would call her back and get the information, and the information would all be on these little index cards. And so then we would, as a group, meet maybe once a week, and we would pass around the index cards and pull off those that you think that you would be able to handle in the course of the week.
They'd talk to the women they were counselling, and if they wanted to go ahead, put them in touch with an abortionist, and then literally and metaphorically hold their hand through the process of terminating their pregnancy. But a little while after Martha Scott started counselling with Jane, she got pregnant herself.
And so I went to my gynecologist and I said, you know, I really don't think I can do this, what would be 5th baby. And I said, can you do anything for me? And he said, no, but I think I can give you the name of someone who can help you. And he gave me the name of Jane.
And what was that like to go through the process from the other end?
It made me feel as though what we were doing was a good thing. Not a difficult procedure, some physical difficulties for a short period of time, a sense of being taken care of. And I thought, if this is the kind of experience that people are coming through, that's okay.
It wasn't easy to find someone to actually perform the abortions. Any doctor who did it ran the risk of prosecution and potentially prison. So when the group found an abortionist prepared to work with them regularly for a cheaper group rate, they developed a close relationship. They knew him as Mike.
Eventually, we discovered as a group this person was not a doctor. And this made for two things. One, some people saying, I don't want to do this anymore. So the group got smaller. But it did this other thing of many of us saying, well, if he's not a doctor, how hard is this to do?
And so they started to learn to do abortions themselves in private houses and apartments all over Chicago.
It had the feel of this is the way it should be, women helping women. And it also had the feel of, oh, what in the world are we doing out there?
Well, because I think a lot of people would be horrified by what you guys were doing, not just from a point of view of whether abortion is right or wrong, but also just because of the risks involved.
Yes, but we were very cautious. We had drugs that dealt with infection and techniques that dealt with excess bleeding. So I don't think we were foolish, but when you think about it in medical terms, we certainly overstepped the line. There's no two ways about that.
Demand for the Jane's services grew and grew, and so did Martha Scott's involvement.
And then at some point I was asked, was I interested in actually seeing the procedure and maybe being a hand holder? And so having done that, little by little, I was asked, did I want to try this first thing? Did I want to try this second thing? And over the course of a couple of months, I was actually doing abortions.
But in May 1972, they got busted after the sister-in-law of one of the women getting an abortion tipped off the police. Martha and 6 other members of Jane were arrested.
We spent a night in jail, and then we were bailed out the next day. And lucky for us, before our court case came up, Roe v. Wade was decided.
The landmark court case Roe v. Wade in 1973 effectively legalized abortion across the US, making underground abortion networks like Jane redundant. The group began to break up. Some of the Janes went on to run a Well Women clinic in Chicago, and many of them, including Martha Scott, are still campaigning for women's rights.
We were pretty ordinary folks, housewives and students, and some people were professional women. I remember one woman who joined the group was a banker, there was a woman who was a nurse, whatever. We were not exceptional in being particularly brave or particularly radical. We started out doing something that was important to do, and it radicalized us.
After every 9 months blue.
Martha Scott was speaking to Lucy Burns. Well, the Egyptian writer and commentator Adaf Sueif is still with us. Now, in the history of women's rights and reproductive rights, how central is the question of abortion, and not just in the US?
It must have always been central. And I think what is so fascinating about this clip that we've just heard is how it is that perfectly ordinary people get to do quite radical and revolutionary things which possibly change other people's lives just through doing what they feel is right and what is actually needed by the community at a particular point.
There is also the whole question of contraception and the role that might have played in history.
We certainly know about the ancient Egyptians who were practicing contraception and so on,
And in ancient Egypt, would it have been women exercising forms of contraception for themselves? It wasn't something that was imposed upon them in any way?
You know what? I think that women in ancient Egypt had nothing imposed upon them. The more that I read about it and look into it, the more it seems that they were truly autonomous, that the issue never came up, actually, of whether this citizen was male or female.
That's Adaf Sueif, and we'll be hearing more from her later. Still to come in this podcast, a 19th century Chinese empress and India's 1966 Miss World.
I thought number 2 would win it. She was Miss Yugoslavia. And I'm looking at the other 3 and thinking to myself, gosh, they haven't got the right girl. And then they announced me and I was absolutely stunned about it.
Now she's entitled to call herself the most beautiful girl in the world, but the new Miss World wants to turn down.
And doesn't that sound dated? But before that, Greece, and what was a huge story in the 1980s. In fact, it still rankles to this day. It's the story of the Parthenon marbles, or the Elgin marbles. This is the collection of huge classical reliefs taken from the Temple of the Parthenon in Athens in the 19th century by the British Earl of Elgin. He cheerfully carted them all off back to London, where they remain in the British Museum. Yes, Greek marble reliefs in the British Museum. Claire Bowes of the Witness History team has looked into this and the story of one woman's determined effort to get them back to Greece. And Claire is with us now. Hello, Claire. The British Museum had held on to these things for more than 100 years until that controversy erupted again in the 1980s. What was the spark?
Well, it was largely to do with a film star by the name of Melina Mercouri. And she was an internationally recognised actress in the 1960s. She was tall. She was a really striking blonde with huge, piercing brown eyes. But by 1981, she was the Greek Minister of Culture. But what this meant was that when she came to visit Britain in 1983 to talk about the marbles, she was relatively well known. She'd been to Britain in the 60s. She'd been nominated for a British Academy Film Award for her most famous film, which was called Never on Sunday. And on another occasion, she even met the Queen. So she was a relatively well-known quantity. And she transitioned to a political career in the late 60s. And pretty much as soon as she was made Minister of Culture in 1981, she sort of turned her attention to the marbles. And she began to talk about the return of the marbles. And this was kind of the first time it had been publicly raised, and so significantly, since the Second World War. And these marbles, which are 2,500 years old, they're huge and have long been a key attraction at the museum. But it seems that Melina Mercouri was the first person to really explain, certainly to the British, what the marbles meant to Greece.
What does the Taj Mahal mean to India? What do the paintings in the Sistine Chapel mean to Italy? The Parthenon marbles are our pride. They are our identity. They are today's link with Greek excellence. They are creations synonymous with our concepts of democracy and freedom. They are our cultural heritage. They are our soul.
When she broached the idea of the repatriation of the marbles at a UN conference just a year earlier, Melina Mercouri had received a 4-minute standing ovation and the support of 54 countries.
Melina became the voice of the marbles. In other words, the marbles that had been silent for all these centuries finally found their voice.
Victoria Solomonides first met Melina Mercouri when she came to London to call for the return of the marbles.
In 1983, I was serving as cultural attaché at the Embassy of Greece in London, and it was part of my brief to work with the Minister of Culture. She was, it is not an exaggeration, she was a goddess. She was a living goddess.
Victoria accompanied Melina on the most high-profile element of her visit, a tour of the British Museum to view the marbles on display in the Divine Galleries.
So we go through the side entrance. She's received by the director of the museum, and then we move to the Divine Galleries. There's a hush around her, and all hell breaks loose because, of course, there are about 300 journalists there from all over the universe. It was the aura of the goddess.
This is our history.
Do you think that the British will, in the end, be sympathetic to your cause and return the marbles to Greece?
I hope with all my heart, and the Greek people are hoping with all the heart.
So why did they mean so much to the Greek people? They were created to decorate a temple above Athens, part of the Acropolis. In the early 19th century, the British Museum had bought half of a 300-metre-long sculptural frieze which once wrapped around the temple. It features dozens of men on horseback and evokes a real sense of movement and energy. Victoria Solomonides says these objects symbolise the highest point in Greek history.
5th century Athens was at the apogee of its power and its wealth and its importance in the then known world. Therefore, the Parthenon in particular epitomizes for Greeks across the generations what we have contributed to world culture, to democracy, to everything that is connected with Greece.
In contrast, when the sculptures were removed, Greece was on its knees, under the control of its old enemy Turkey, and the statues, which had already taken a battering in a previous war, were in danger of further damage. The accepted story in Britain is that Lord Elgin, the then British ambassador, asked for permission to remove some of them for protection, although Melina Mercouri had a slightly different take on the story.
This permission was distorted from the frieze that was 524 feet long. She literally ripped 247 feet, and in the process caused terrible damage to the rest of this monument.
Whatever the exact truth of the story, Lord Elgin sold the sculptures to the British government, and they were entrusted to the British Museum. They became one of its most prized possessions. On her visit to London, Melina Mercouri confronted the museum director, David Wilson, over his fears that this request would not only deprive the museum of a unique exhibit, but would lead to the emptying of the entire British Museum.
No, I don't want to ruin the British Museum. I want my
well, you're in a dilemma,
back.
are you not? Yes, you want your marbles and other people want their marbles.
David Wilson stood firm. The Elgin marbles would not be going anywhere.
We're not going to return those marbles at all. This museum owns the Elgin marbles. And
that is the legal position?
That is the legal position. No way can there be a legal claim against us.
Melina Mercouri argues, of course, that the Elgin marbles, because they're an integral part of the Parthenon, are quite a special case.
There is a special case that could be made for any country in the world which wants any material from the British Museum. But there is another argument. The British Museum is a special case for the world. If you start to take the British Museum away, then you are taking a major part of the world heritage away.
In 1984, the British government officially refused the request for the return of the marbles.
How long are you going to continue your campaign?
Oh, every day, until they come back. And I believe that one day they will come back.
Melina Mercouri continued campaigning until her death 10 years later.
Sometimes I catch myself talking about her in the present. This is because, for some of us, she has never left. And it is a prophecy that she made all these years ago. When asked when would it be that the marbles will come back, she replied, I don't know when the marbles will come back. I may not be alive at the time. But when they do, I will be reborn.
And that was Victoria Solomonides, former cultural attaché at the Greek embassy in London. Now, interestingly, there was another blonde vaguely connected with this story. 25 years ago, in 1986, a young, fluffy-haired student at Oxford University chaired a debate over the return of the marbles. Now, he was Boris Johnson, at the time president of the Oxford Union Debating Society, obviously currently the British Prime Minister. Now, he hosted Melina Mercouri back then for a debate on the return, and the response was a huge majority in favour of a return. But obviously that was many, many years ago. To bring us up to date, the Parthenon marbles remain at the British Museum. Just to be clear, they don't own them. They've been entrusted to them by the British government, so it's up to the British government to decide on their future.
Claire, many thanks. That's Claire Bowes. Well, listening to that with us is Adaf Soueif, Egyptian writer and commentator. And, Egypt has its own issues with cultural appropriation and indeed with the British Museum, Adaf.
Well, I think actually the Parthenon is a special case, and it's very, very much an open wound. They are unique. They're not like they have lots of these statues. This is the prime heritage symbol of Greece, the destination for every visitor, and it's visibly missing. So you go to the Parthenon and the sculptures are not there. It's pretty flagrant. And I think there is another point. The narrative is that Lord Elgin took them by permission of the then governor of Greece. But the governor of Greece at the time was Ottoman, because Greece was part of the Ottoman Empire. And so there you have a declining empire, the Ottoman, enabling an empire in power to acquire the artworks. So it's sort of represented as if it's a bureaucratic spat between two European states, but it isn't. It is actually a very good example of a decolonization issue.
And you say that the Parthenon marbles are a unique case, but doesn't Egypt have any claim over all the Egyptian mummies which hang around in the British Museum?
Well, I mean, it's a moot point. There are people who think that everything ought to be returned, and there are people who think that actually, since Egypt has so much wealth of its antique heritage in Egypt, then these artifacts abroad have actually acted as ambassadors for Egypt, and that's a good function for them to have. An open question.
Adaf, thanks again. That's Adaf Souif, Egyptian novelist and political commentator. It's been great to have you with us from Cairo. Thank you so much. Well, talking of women and powerful advocacy, let's go to 19th century China next for the remarkable story of the Empress Dowager Cixi. She effectively ruled for nearly 50 years until she died in 1908, and she presided over monumental changes. But for decades, she was vilified as a tyrant. It wasn't until the 1970s that her story was properly reassessed. For Witness History, Rebecca Kesby heard from the woman behind that reassessment.
She was described as an evil ruler, domineering. She supposedly murdered her son, murdered her nephew. She was bloodthirsty, and she brought down the Manchu rule of China.
So it's fair to say, then, that history had not been kind to the Empress Dowager Cixi. A contemporary of Queen Victoria, she was little known outside China and little respected under the communist regime that eventually followed her. Most of the accounts used as evidence for any academic comment about her had been based on palace gossip and rumour. That is until a young PhD student at the University of California, Su Fawn Chung, decided to forensically study the original documents. Probably the first person ever to do so.
I thought this very important leader of China has never really been studied in a scholarly manner and really needs to be done. So that's how I embarked on this subject.
It was the mid-70s, and women's movements were challenging male dominance all over the world. Even in China, the question of female leadership was at the centre of politics.
Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, wanted to emphasize the possibility of the role of a female leader of China because that's what she aspired to. So she decided to revise or relook at the Empress Dowager Cixi.
But Madame Mao, or Jiang Qing's own unpopularity after Mao's death in 1976, didn't exactly help her attempts to re-establish Cixi as a great leader. And anyway, in spite of a global feminist wave, it was still tough for women to get anywhere.
My undergraduate advisor, when I was doing my senior honors thesis, said, "Don't hope to get a job as a professor in a university because the history departments are very conservative and would never hire a woman."
Nevertheless, Su Fawn Chung persisted, even learning the Manchu language as well as Chinese to interpret official documents.
I wanted to see what the court records said about her. There were diaries and recordings and collected papers of officials who supported her, but one of the interesting things that emerged was the writings of two English historians whom I subsequently learned hated Queen Victoria, who ruled at the same time as the Empress Dowager. Their animosity towards their own female ruler came out in their writing.
So the story was being told then from a very misogynistic viewpoint.
All history in those days were written by men, and if you were a male who was offended by a female ruler, you only wrote bad things about her.
So how did Cixi make this extraordinary and unlikely rise to power in the first place? Well, originally she was selected as a low-ranking concubine or official mistress of the emperor. She was born into a Manchu family, a minority ethnic group, but one that had dominated China's ruling elite for generations, and with a different culture to the majority Han Chinese.
The Manchus allowed women to have strong positions in their tribes. The Chinese always felt a woman should be obedient to her father in youth, obedient to her husband in marriage, and obedient to her son when she becomes a widow. So Cixi went into this world.
But as the only concubine to produce a male child, she was elevated to the title Empress. Her natural intelligence and political acumen meant she soon became a favourite and close advisor to the emperor.
This particular emperor that she married was a sort of weakling, And he liked Cixi, and he found her to be intelligent, so he allowed her to sit into debates at court as to how to control China in this period of great change, and particularly what to do about Westerners who were coming into the country trying to sell opium to the people, and he was afraid of them. And she took a more determined stance and said, we have to do something about the situation that we're facing. And so what we see is a great court debate going on. And then all of a sudden he dies, and his son, who is still a minor, is to be the new emperor.
But Cixi's son was only 5 when he became the new emperor, leaving his mother, now the Empress Dowager, as the real decision-maker. When he died, suddenly, she put her infant nephew on the throne and continued her own rule. But amid the chaos in China, she became seen as a steady hand.
So she builds a clique of officials, both Manchu and Chinese, and they felt that she provided a stable society, which allows the modernization of Chinese government.
It seems as if she tried to persuade people, to convince people, was always trying to build consensus rather than being too combative. Is that also partly because her own position initially was quite precarious?
Yes, I think so. And she found people who were willing to work with her. They admired her and they were willing to support her.
By now, Cixi was incredibly powerful and respected for her strong, if ruthless, leadership. But she still had to operate within ancient gender-specific traditions, such as never speaking face-to-face with a man and sitting behind the throne, obscured by a curtain.
They had a screen put up, and all of the officials would bow down to the throne, which was an empty chair, or her nephew. He would sit there, and she would be behind the screen and listen to what was going on, and she would make the decision. And they all knew that she was making the decision.
The Empress Dowager Cixi died in 1908, leaving a 2-year-old boy on the throne. In less than 3 years, the Manchu Qing dynasty fell under pressure from reformers. So you wrote your paper, The Much Maligned Empress Dowager, in the late 70s, and it had an immediate effect on how this period of Chinese history was viewed. Did you find yourself actually liking her, though, as a character?
I tried to understand her and her motives, but I don't think I particularly liked her because she was such a domineering, you might say even pig-headed woman.
But did you end up admiring her, perhaps in a way that you hadn't before?
Yes, absolutely, because I don't think she was as evil as historians have portrayed her. And hopefully what we'll see in the future is more people using Chinese sources to understand the complicated world that she faced.
Su Fong-chung was speaking to Rebecca Kesby. And Rebecca is with us now. The Empress Cixi, Rebecca, may have represented political stability in her life, but from what you've uncovered, that sense didn't last long after she died.
Hello, Max. Yeah, it's such a fascinating period of history, this. I mean, it really is quite chaotic, in fact. You could say that Cixi represented relative stability, or at least some stability, amid all that chaos, I suppose is the best way of putting it, because it was a very difficult period for China, which we should never forget is absolutely enormous and very diverse. And it was facing massive challenges internally. There were rebellions, local feuds spilling out between factions, and there were significant external challenges and threats from overseas as well, notably from Europe, particularly Britain with the Opium Wars, but also from France and Russia, and of course the oldest enemy, Japan, all looking for influence and to profit from China's resources. And Cixi navigated all of that.
And domestically, apart from those external threats, she did also preside over a great deal of reform.
That's right. Under her leadership, the economy grew, modern industries began to take off, the population increased, there were improvements in education for girls and an outlawing of the tradition of foot binding, basically hobbling girls and women. And she was a talented and shrewd politician, as well as being, as we heard, a bit of a despot and tyrant. But she gave clear leadership, and there were even baby steps towards parliamentary democracy.
So where did she go wrong then? Because, as you say in the piece, the Qing dynasty fell less than 3 years after her death.
Well, where some think Ceszkqc got it wrong was that as she aged, she became more isolated and she lost support of some of her key advisors. And crucially, she failed to train up anyone behind her to replace her when she died, possibly because she was paranoid that they would try and topple her before she died. But of course, when she died in 1908, it left the whole Manchu Qing dynasty exposed. And by then, there were growing nationalist feelings in the country. The majority Han Chinese were grumpy about the dominance of the ethnic Manchu in positions of power, and the whole lot really started to crumble. The Wuchang uprising was in 1911, I think, and that was really the start of the next phase of Chinese history and the Nationalist Republic of China. One more thing, though, Max. This story does illustrate how important the narrative of history is and the perspective. Who writes it? Who tells the story? Our guest, Su Fawn Chung, knew that the only way to get to the real story was to go back to the original documents, the eyewitness testimony, if you like, which I guess is what we try to do on this programme.
Indeed. Rebecca Kesby, many thanks. I don't mind admitting that I knew very little about the Empress Ceszkqc before you uncovered that story. Well, finally, as we've been looking at some of the women who've made history, and we've featured on the World Service this week, a Miss World. The whole idea of a beauty contest is largely tarnished these days, but we're going back to what you might call a less enlightened era. In 1966, Rita Farrier became the first Indian woman to be crowned Miss World, and she's been speaking to Orna Merchant.
Beauty, like music, knows no language barriers. That's proven once again at the Miss World contest in London.
I wasn't the archetypical of a beauty queen. I was a 66-1 outsider to win the competition.
Rita Farrier, the medical student from Bombay, the first Indian girl ever to win this most coveted title.
Rita Farrier grew up in Mumbai, formerly Bombay, in India, and from an early age, she always knew what she wanted to do with her life.
I had developed childhood asthma at about 6 or 7 years of age, and I was so grateful to the medical staff that at that point I decided, well, I'd like to do something like that. I'd like to help people that need the help.
In fact, thoughts of entering a beauty contest couldn't have been further from her mind.
I had no interest in either makeup or dressing or anything. I'd get up in the morning, brush my teeth and comb my hair, never look at a mirror till I was brushing my teeth again in the evening. You know, but there were people that used to comment on my looks. In fact, when I was about 16, I was in a restaurant and one of the movie producers came up and said, "Would you like for us to offer your daughter a movie contract?" And my mother was appalled.
The Miss World beauty competition had been running since the 1950s. It was organised by the British entertainment company Mecca, and it had turned into a huge TV extravaganza, watched by millions every year.
The Miss World competition has managed to attract the cream of the international beauties.
1966 was the first year that India decided to take part in Miss World, and competitions were run in 5 cities to find a Miss India. Rita Farrier was in her final year of medical studies, and it was her sister who suggested entering the Miss Bombay contest.
She said, "Why don't you have a go? You might just get a trip to London." So she took me to a photographer to get a photograph taken, sent it in. And lo and behold, they selected me for the final.
Rita won Miss Bombay dressed in a sari, and it was only when she ended up in the final to become Miss India that she had to wear a swimsuit.
And that was the first time I paraded in a swimsuit in my life. So it was a big shock to my system, you know, when I won one and then the other.
Still reeling from her win, Rita found herself heading to London. But because this was the first time India had sent a contestant, she didn't get a lot of support.
There was no preparation except that I was told, now you've got to stand straight and walk straight and smile at everyone. But I mean, you know, I was representing India and I should have perhaps had a little more backing at the rehearsals. I was told by the organisers then that the swimsuit that I had was really not suitable because it was borrowed and it didn't quite fit.
51 women had entered Miss World that year, and Rita was now in the final 7.
Finally, they were announced from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2. I thought number 2 would win it. She was Miss Yugoslavia. And I'm looking at the other 3 and thinking to myself, you know, gosh, they haven't got the right girl. And then they announced me, and I was absolutely stunned about it.
Now she's entitled to call herself the most beautiful girl in the world, But the new Miss World wants to turn down any offers of film contracts in favour of her study.
Although over that year she got to travel all over the world promoting Miss World, she knew that she needed to complete her medical training and fulfil her real ambition in life.
I was literally living out of a suitcase for the year until coming very near to the end of my year as Miss World. November would have been the next competition, when Mecca said, would I like to complete my medical studies in London? And I absolutely jumped at it.
Rita Faria is the first winner ever to become a doctor.
Of course I'm proud that I won the competition. I was very proud for India.
But does she still think there's a place for it in today's world?
I don't, to be quite honest. And in fact, it really has passed its sell-by date in the sense that the world has matured and there really is no fairy tale to anything anymore.
Rita Faria, Miss World 1966, speaking to Orna Merchant. Perhaps generally there are no fairy tale endings, but for Dr. Faria, there's been one. That's it for this edition of the History Hour podcast. Don't forget to check out the website, which is packed full of gems from the past. Just search for BBC Witness History. We'll be back next week with another History Hour. Until then, from me, Max Pearson, and the whole team, thanks for listening. Goodbye.